You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Monday. I hope you're having a good day so far, that it was a great first day of the week for you after a good weekend. It's gorgeous up here in the Minnesota-Wisconsin area. I'm not far from the Twin Cities. When I say I'm in Wisconsin, I'm just across the border, across the river. So we're about 45 minutes from the downtown Minneapolis area. And so up here, it's gorgeous. It was a sunny day, gorgeous temps. Fall is upon us. It was about 65 degrees today, so I hope your day was as good as my day. And, of course, you're listening to me, Scotty Roberts, right here on the Intrepid radio program, here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And you can go hear the audio version of this over at odysy1.com. That's odyssey1.com. And, of course, if you're watching on the video, you don't need to know this. But if you're just listening and would like to join the simulcast video broadcast of this radio broadcast and join the live chat room that's going on, you can go to my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And that's Mr. all spelled out. All right. So thanks for being here. I appreciate your taking your time to come in and join me for another excursion into whatever we're talking about today. You know, there are some days I come to this show and I say, wow, what am I going to talk about today? I've got lots of topics and all kinds of stuff that I can talk about, but when it comes down to organizing it, researching it if I need to, finding out information, sometimes I'm just stumped because I have so many different things I could talk about. I'm like, what do I want to get into today? And last week on Friday, we started this little series into the Jesus mysteries. And so it's really, to me, it's very interesting stuff. It challenges your faith if you are in a Christian tradition, or if you are Christian. It gives you a little different perspective on some of the things. And I'm not saying all of this is factual. I'm saying these are the questions that are raised when looking at the story of Jesus. Who was the guy? Was he exactly as the Bible presents him? Was he an historical character? Because while there's this great picture of him in the biblical passages, in the Gospels, and then, of course, when all through the New Testament, the different epistles and the different books written obviously are focused on him and what he started by the way of a movement and became a religion. So the big question is, did he really exist, or was he the creation of his followers to some extent? And I think you can't ignore the fact that he's there in history. Some people want to say just because it's in the Bible that it's not real, there's nothing to it, it's all fabrication and so on. And I think we've proven in many cases over past shows I've done, past things I've written about, that just because the story comes out of the Bible doesn't mean it's pure mythology, doesn't mean it's pure fabrication or pure fiction. And there's a lot of historical information in the Bible that's been verified over and over again over the last couple of centuries, especially the last half a century with the advance of archaeological data and anthropological data and so on. And so that Jesus existed, I don't think is so much a question for me, at least historically. There was somebody named Jesus. He may have been exactly what we were taught in Sunday school in the Christian church. He may have been something completely different. The problem that we run into is when you try to go outside the biblical texts, finding information about the man historically is really tough. So what do? You start looking at what's out there, what's available out there, what's been written about him, what's been written about other messianic types around his time period? What's been written about other messianic types prior to his time period? And so there's all these questions, and when you start looking at it, you wonder what and who was Jesus? Did he exist as we think he existed? Does that render the religion that is founded around him insubstantive? Does it render it of none effect because you could attribute it to somebody else during his day? Those are the big questions. That's where faith separates from history, or faith separates from fact. Sometimes we believe something by faith, whether we have the facts in hand or not. That's the definition of faith. Even the Apostle Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, who hijacked Christianity, he said that faith is the substance of things not seen, the evidence of things hoped for. Or did I mix that up? It's the evidence of things not seen, the substance of things hoped for. So all in all, you don't really have a really good, solid foundation for determining whether or not Jesus was a real guy other than the faith that we put in him. So I'm not going to look at the faith so much tonight, although we'll reference it in places. I want to look at other material around that and ask, did he exist the way we think he existed? And we left off on Friday talking about the Gnostics. I went through this whole list of, I'll go through this list again. Who is this when I'm talking about this guy? He was a guy who, his father was God, his mother was a mortal virgin. He's born in a cave or a humble cowshed on December 25th before 3 shepherds. He offers his followers the chance to be born again through the rites of baptism. He miraculously turns water into wine at a marriage ceremony. He rides triumphantly into a town on a donkey while people wave palm leaves to honor him. He dies at Easter time as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. After his death, he descends into hell, and on the 3rd day he rises from the dead and ascends to heaven in glory. His followers await for his return as the judge during the last days. His death and resurrection are celebrated by a ritual meal of bread and wine, the communion services, which symbolize his body and blood. So these are the motifs, but the problem with all of those, every one of those things, if you would answer the question, why, that's Jesus of Nazareth, that's Jesus Christ. Yes, but it is also at least a dozen other, a dozen other messianic types that we've kind of grouped into this collective called Osiris Dionysus type. They share the same biographical notes as Jesus. What does that do to you when you hear that, first of all? There was Justin Martyr, who was I believe a 1st to 2nd century Christian apologist, who wrote, well, that's just diabolical mimicry. And what he meant was, and he explained this in his own words, was that he believed that was Satan raising up false messiahs ahead of time, knowing that when God's own son would come to the earth, he would share some of the same traits. And so Satan diabolically mimicked in advance who the real Son of God would be. And I would have to ask, what takes more faith to believe? That Satan could do that? And God couldn't change or reshuffle the deck a little bit to make sure that didn't happen? Why would God allow that to happen if this was his only son? And these are some of the questions I had. So, viewed impartially, it appears that the story of Jesus is just another version of these stories. So what do we do with that? And the obvious explanation is that as early church Christianity became the dominant power in the previously pagan world, popular motifs from pagan mythology became grafted into the the biography of Jesus. And this is a possibility that's even put forward by many Christian theologians. The virgin birth, for example, that's something that's often regarded as this extraneous later addition that should not be understood literally. There are even Christian scholars who believe that it shouldn't be taken literally. And these motifs were borrowed from paganism in the same way that pagan festivals were adopted into Christianity for the Christian saints' days. Christmas being one of the December 25th date being one of them. So this theory is common among those who go looking for the real Jesus, the real historical Jesus. And he's hidden underneath the weight of the accumulated mythological debris. And so, attractive as it appears, at first, to us, this explanation seems fairly inadequate. We had to, as scholars I'm talking about, I had to collate this comprehensive body of similarities that there remained hardly any significant elements in the biography of Jesus that you don't find figured by the mysteries or prefigured by the mysteries. That pre-incarnation of these elements in somebody else before the mysteries of Jesus. And on top of this, you discover that Jesus' teachings weren't original to him, but had been anticipated by the pagan sages. And if there's a real Jesus somewhere underneath all of this, we'd have to acknowledge that we could know absolutely nothing about him, for all that remained for us was later pagan accretions. And such a position kind of seems absurd. And surely there was a more elegant solution to this. This is a conundrum that we end up with in the Christian faith that asks, well, if Jesus is just a later version of a dozen or more other stories that all have these same elements to them, was he created out of whole cloth? Was he a real guy, a real teacher, somebody who had followers? And then did the followers add things to it? So let's take a look at Gnosticism, the Gnostics themselves. When you puzzle over these discoveries of these more ancient Messiah figures, you have to start questioning the received picture of the early church and have a look at the evidence all by ourselves. We have to discover that far from being the united congregation of saints and martyrs that traditional history would have us believe, the early Christian community was actually made up of a whole spectrum of different groups. And these can be broadly categorized into two different schools. And on the one hand, there were those we'll call literalists, okay? The biblical literalists, the literal storytellers. Because what defines them is what they take the Jesus story to be. A literal, true account of historical events. And it was this school of Christianity that was adopted by the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, and becoming Roman Catholicism later, and all its subsequent offshoots, by the way, Lutheranism, which broke off, Baptists, which broke off, all the other denominations. And so Roman Catholicism was the one that accepted the literalist view of Jesus being a real historical person. That's what I grew up in. That's what I was taught. That's what I learned in Bible college and seminary and all through my ministry days. And on the other hand, there were those who had held a point of view that was radically different, and they were known as the Gnostics. And these forgotten Christians were later persecuted out of existence by the literalist Roman Church. And such thoroughness that until almost recently, in the last several decades, was when we learned about the Gnostics and their writings. We knew little about them except through the writings of their detractors until more recent days. And only a handful of original Gnostic texts survived, none of which were published before the 19th century in the 1800s. And this situation changed dramatically, however, with this remarkable discovery in 1945, when an Arab peasant kid stumbled upon a whole library of Gnostic Gospels hidden in a cave near Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And this gave scholars access to many texts which were in wide circulation amongst the early Christian church and the early Christian believers, before there was the formal universal Roman Catholic Church. And they were deliberately excluded from the canon of the New Testament. The canon, if you're not familiar with the word canon, the accepted God-breathed Word of God. The books in the New Testament that were the accepted ones to be in the Bible. But they were deliberately excluded. And the Gospels attributed to, say, Thomas, one of the other disciples, to Philip, texts recording the Acts of Peter and the 12 disciples, apocalypses attributed to Paul and James, and so on. And so it seemed to us extraordinary that the whole library of early Christian documents could be discovered, containing what purport to be the teachings of Christ and his disciples, and yet so few modern followers of Christianity even knew that they existed. Why hasn't every Christian rushed out to read these newly discovered words of the Master? If you are a Christian, and you bear the name Christian, and you accept that you are Christian, why wouldn't you want to go find out what these texts say? Do you even know they exist is another big question. And it seems that even though 2,000 years have passed, what keeps them from confined to the small number of Gospels selected for inclusion in the New Testament? Why do we only have 4 Gospels over 2,000 years that are in the accepted canon of Scripture, when there were over 60 Gospels written during the same time period, a little less than 2,000 years ago? So why aren't we questioning that? It seems that even though those 2 millennia have passed since the Gnostics were purged, during which time the Roman Church is split into Protestantism and thousands of other alternative groups, the Gnostics were still not regarded as a legitimate voice of Christianity. Those who do explore the Gnostic Gospels, by the way, discover a little different form of Christianity than you might be used to. It's quite alien, in fact, to the religion which we're familiar in Christianity. We find ourselves studying these strange, esoteric tracts with titles such as Hypostasis of the Archons and The Thought of Noria. It almost sounds like episodes of Star Trek when you think about it. And in a way, they kind of were. The Gnostics truly were psychonauts who boldly explored the final frontiers of inner space. They searched for the origins and the meanings of life. And these people were mystics. They were creative free thinkers. It was obvious to me that they were so hated by the bishops of the literal church hierarchy that they were almost written out of existence. To literalists of the Bible, literalists of the Jesus story, the Gnostics were dangerous heretics and still are. Their writings are considered heresy to the church. And in volumes of anti-Gnostic works, an unintentional testimony to the power and the influence of Gnosticism within the early Christianity, they painted them as Christians who had gone native. They'd gone back to paganism or remained in paganism. Gone native, gone Indian, as they used to say in the Old West. Oh, he went out there to hunt Indian, he's gone Indian. And that's the way they kind of refer to them. They claim that they had become contaminated by the paganism that surrounded them, and they'd abandoned the purity of the true faith. And this is how they could come up with all this alternate stuff about Jesus. The Gnostics saw themselves as the authentic Christian tradition. And they predated the organization of the Roman Catholic Church and the big organized church. They claimed to know the secret inner and the inner traditions, the inner mysteries, all the church was an imitation church. And they claimed to know all these mysteries of Christianity which the literalists did not possess. Did you know that, and we're going to get into these at another time, not specifically tonight, but so much of the church tradition that you see, the liturgy in the Roman Catholic Church and in Christianity watered down in the more Protestant forms of the religion, had their basis in mysticism and magic that the Gnostics practiced, that the Gnostics recognized. Now, the beliefs and practices of the Gnostics tell us that the literalists had at least been right about one thing. The Gnostics were little different from the pagans. Like the philosophers of the pagans' mysteries, they believed in reincarnation. They honored the goddess Sophia. Who was Sophia? Do you remember? They were immersed in the mystical Greek philosophy of Plato. Gnostics means knowers. Gnostic means know. Gnostics were the knowers, a name that they acquired because, like the initiates of the pagan mysteries, they believed that their secret teachings had the power to impart gnosis, which is knowledge. That's a direct experiential knowledge of God, the gnosis. And there was a word also in the Greek, the kenosis, which was what they called the emptying of Jesus, that when God became human, he emptied himself of his godhead, his godhood. And it was the kenosis, the emptying, the unknowledging, if you will, of himself. And he had to grow back into that, according to Christianity. So, like the initiates in the pagan mysteries, the Gnostics believed that their secret teachings had the power to impart gnosis. And the pagan initiate could become a god. Small g. So for the Gnostics, the goal of the Christian initiate was to become a Christ, not to follow one. And so what particularly struck me as I started researching a lot of this stuff was that the Gnostics weren't concerned with the historical Jesus. They viewed the Jesus story in the same way that the pagan philosophers viewed the myth of Osiris Dionysus. The collective of these old gods, these old godmen, these old messianic types. They were an allegory, and Jesus, they believed, the Christ, was an allegory which encoded secret mystical teachings. And this insight really all came together as a remarkable possibility, that this is the truth of what's going on behind the scenes. And perhaps the explanation for the similarities between pagan myths and the biography of Jesus has been staring us in the face the whole time. We just haven't seen it. But we've been so caught up with the traditional ways of thinking that we'd been unable to comprehend or even understand what these were. And of course, until just a couple of centuries ago, we didn't even know about them. And so this is going to launch us into what I want to spend a little bit of time in tonight, the Jesus mystery thesis. It's the traditional version of history bequeathed to us the authorities of the Roman Church, and that's what Christianity developed from the teachings of the Jewish Messiah, that the Gnosticism was a later deviation. And what would happen is if the picture were reversed and Gnosticism viewed the authentic Christianity just as the Gnostics themselves claimed, Could it be that Orthodox Christianity was a later deviation from Gnosticism? What about that? Gnosticism certainly came earlier. And that Gnosticism was a synthesis of Judaism and the pagan mystery religion. What people forget, by the way, about Christianity is that Christianity is just a sect of Judaism. So this was the beginning of the Jesus mystery thesis, as has been put out there. And we got to go to break. We're already through the first half of the show. So sit there for 2 minutes. I'll be right back. Hey folks, this is Scotty Roberts. Welcome back to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And you can hear the audio version that goes out to all our syndicates, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Spreaker, and all of those, as well as to several different radio stations around the country. You can find us at odysy1.com, odyssey1.com. And you can also come over and see the simulcast in video on my YouTube stream right now, where we also have a live chat going and everybody's discussing these topics over in the chat window. You can come and join them at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. So come on over and join us. Or just listen if that's all you can do tonight. So the Jesus story we're talking about, Gnosticism, the Jesus mysteries. Where did this all start? Why did it start? How did it become what it became? Why did it become hidden? Why don't we know about these things in Christianity? And if you are Christian, and by the way, when I say that, sometimes you don't have to be an active Christian. You can be Christianized. Grew up in the church. Grew up in Sunday school. Went your own way. Some of these questions, when I was in ministry in the Christian church, were questions I first started exploring, and I wanted to know more about it. And what I started to find was that the Jesus story in the Bible, the literalist story, does have all the hallmarks of a myth. So could it be that this is exactly what it is? Is the Jesus story a myth? And really, nobody has really read the newly discovered Gnostic Gospels and taken their fantastic stories as literally true. They're all readily seen as myths. And it's only from familiarity and cultural prejudice, religious prejudice, that have prevented us from seeing the New Testament Gospels in the same light. If those Gospels, the four that we have, had also been lost to us, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, had been lost to us and only recently discovered, Who would read these tales for the first time and believe that they were the historical accounts of a man born of a virgin? Who had walked on water? Who returned from the dead? Who raised the dead? Who turned water into wine? There was a scene where Jesus, when he was 12 years old, was separated from his parents, and they were returning from Jerusalem back to Nazareth with the caravan heading back. And along the way, they realized Jesus isn't with us. They have to turn around and go back to Jerusalem. Where's our son? And they find him in the temple. And what's he doing in the temple in Jerusalem but sitting with the rabbis and the priests? And he's teaching them at age 12. And they're all rapt listening to him, rapt attention. And Jesus' mother finds him, and I could imagine she shakes him up a bit. Where the hell you been? We were halfway back to Nazareth. We realized you weren't with us. What was Jesus' response? He said, don't you know that I would have been about my Father's business? Then the scene ends. So he's about his Father's business in the temple, teaching. So does that sound like, to me, that has the smack of apologetic about it, the smack of a written story. Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen that way. I'm saying what it sounds like, especially in light of that there's so much more information out there. But we were told, I know when I was in seminary, all this Gnostic stuff, that's all heresy. That's the work of the devil. But why should it be? Why should we consider it that? What makes that the work of the devil? And so, if all those Gospels have been lost to us, the Gospels in the New Testament that exist, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, would we be able to accept them if they came up to us today? Or would we see them as myth? So, why should we consider then the stories of all these other ancient messianic figures from around the time of Jesus and before him? Why should we consider those? Osiris, Dionysus, Adonis, Attis, Mithras, and the other pagan mystery saviors as just fables. Yet they come across essentially as the very same story as Jesus of Nazareth, told in a Jewish context, and believe it to be the biography of a carpenter from Bethlehem. Why should we believe that that's true and not believe that any of this other stuff is true when they have very similar stories? I was raised Christian, folks. Well, I'm going to amend that. I was raised Christianized. We were a fairly agnostic family. My mom's stepfather, my grandfather, was a Jewish man, agnostic Jew, almost atheistic Jew. So, take the religion out of Judaism, you know what I'm talking about. So, I was born agnostic, but my mom tried to get us to church. I always had a desire to know who God was, to know who Jesus was, once I had heard about him when I was a little kid. And even though I was raised Christian, I was really surprised to find that despite years of open-minded spiritual exploration, it still felt, and believe me, even nowadays sometimes, still feels a little dangerous to even dare to think outside the box I was taught was so, in that literalist biblical tradition of Jesus. Maybe you hearing this, you've heard this stuff before, maybe you're hearing it for the first time, and maybe you get that initial gut reaction, oh, I can't listen to that. No, there's nothing but what I was taught. Well, folks, there's a whole lot more in Christianity than what you were taught by the literalist church, the Roman Catholic Church, which splintered off into whatever you may be part of. Early indoctrination reaches very, very deep. We're in effect created. Our religion was created. Our indoctrination was created. You listen to a good friend of mine, Jeff Dougherty, talks about unindoctrinating yourself. He's got his show here on this network, one of his shows, and he's also got his own YouTube channel where he does several little vignette shows every day. You can go listen to him. You can pick up his book, a bunch of his books where he talks about this. One in particular was Apostle Paul Antichrist, where he wrote about Paul having hijacked New Testament Christianity. So there's a lot of thought out there on this, but maybe the inner mysteries of Christianity, which the Gnostics taught, but which the literalists denied existed, reveals to us that the Jesus story was not a factual account of God's one and only visit to the planet Earth, but a mystical teaching story designed to help each one of us become a Christ. Now, Jesus of Nazareth, did he exist? I think he probably did in some form. Was he the Son of God? Don't really know. But I can tell you what, I think he was a Son of God. He was something that was brought to us like all these other ancient figures that had the same stories to show us something of God, to help us become a Christ. So the Jesus story has all of the hallmarks of a myth. So could it be that that's exactly what it is? Do you think? The Jesus of Nazareth story? Is it a myth? We talked several months ago about David, King David, and dug into the apologetic story that was written around his life and the events of his life, and found out how so much of that was fictionalized. We actually called the series the true life story of an invented hero. He was a real guy, but there was stuff built up around him to make him look a certain way. And nobody's read all these Gnostic Gospels and decided that they were all fact. Nobody's done that. Why should the Jesus story be different? Unless you accept that by faith, which we talked about at the very beginning. If those Gospels had been lost over the years, it's probably because if they've been lost to us, and let me restate that. I'm thinking as I'm looking at my notes. Let me just look off of my notes and tell you, if all of that was lost to us, those original writings of the Gnostics, it was lost to us, and we rediscovered them, as I stated earlier, we would have a very different view. But we would not abandon what we learned and were indoctrinated to at the very beginning. That's the point I'm trying to make, kind of a recap point. So, the Jesus Mysteries thesis asks us to consider a lot of puzzling questions. And it's always opened up new dilemmas for me. Maybe it would do the same for you. Isn't there indisputable historical evidence for the existence of Jesus the man? Is that a dilemma? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever cared about that? If you're in that religion, have you ever wondered, is this even true? Or do you just accept that by faith? It's what we accept. It's like I mentioned not long ago in some show I was doing, talking about my Jewish cousin from my grandfather's side of the family. I asked him once, I said, what do you think about, they're Jewish, they all go to synagogue, they're not Hasidic Jews or Orthodox Jews, they're Reformed, they're modernized, if you will. He was in advertising, and, that whole side of the family, we didn't really grow up with them. We grew up around them, knowing they existed, them knowing us. But we didn't mix. We were the goy. My grandfather's stepdaughter and her children. And so I asked him once, I went out to lunch with him, and talking advertising stuff. And I asked him what he thought about Jesus being the Messiah. And he said, he says, I don't know. He says, I really don't know. I don't think about it that much. And I asked him what he felt about Judaism. And he says, he says, we're Jewish because it holds our family together. It's a family thing we do. He says, the tradition keeps us all together. And many Jews could say the same. Many Christians could say the same. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So he really didn't know what he believed. He was pretty much like my grandfather, either agnostic or atheistic. and just practiced it because it was good for his family. It was good for the traditions that it brought into his family. But he didn't really know a lot of the information about it. So when I asked that question, isn't there indisputable historical evidence for the existence of Jesus? And how could Gnosticism be the original Christianity when it was Paul the Apostle, St. Paul, who was the earliest Christian we know about, is so vociferously anti-Gnostic? And is it really credible that such an insular, anti-pagan people as the Jews could have adopted the pagan mysteries? And how could it have happened that a consciously created myth came to be believed as literal history? Talking about Jesus of Nazareth. And if the Gnosticism represented genuine Christianity, why was it literal Christianity that came to dominate the world as the most influential religion of all time for the past 2 millennia? All of these difficult questions would have been satisfactorily answered before we could wholeheartedly accept such a radical theory as the Jesus mystery theory. Now, you'd have to answer these questions to understand that there is more to what you think you believe, and what you didn't know was part of the original foundations of your faith. And by the way, the Apostle Paul himself, when I said he hijacked Christianity, I mentioned Jeff Dougherty's book. Go over to Jeff Dougherty's website. I think it's thechristianwhistleblower.com, or at least go over to his YouTube channel. You can find it. Get his book, The Apostle Paul Antichrist, where he writes about how Paul, the apostle, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, hijacked Christianity from Peter and the others. Did you know that there were 4 different messianic sects during the 1st century after the death of Christ? Peter was part of that Jewish messianic sect. Paul was part of the Herodian messianic sect. And those 2 theories were far apart. This is why you see, whether you think it's there or not, you got to read a little deeper. Look at the split in the church between the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter. Peter, who was one of Jesus' disciples. Paul never even saw Jesus face to face, except in what he claimed was a vision. So you have him hijacking Christianity and leading it in most of what you see in Christian church today out of the New Testament, based on the writings of Paul. It's Pauline Christianity. It's not Jesus Christianity. Mull that one over for a minute. So there was, in essence, what I would call a great cover-up when it came to Jesus of Nazareth. The origins of Christianity, if you hail back to the Gnostics, only seems improbable because it contradicts the traditional point of view, the one we've grown up with, the one we were taught. What do you do in, say, archaeology or anthropology or any science when you've believed one thing all the way along? This is the truth about this, the facts. And suddenly that's turned on its ear when new information is learned. And it radically changes that accepted way of doing things, that accepted tradition. You may have that in the Gnostic view. When you push the research on this, the traditional picture began and will begin for you to completely unravel around you. You're going to find yourself embroiled in a world of schism, power struggles, forged documents, false identities, letters that have been edited and added to, and of the wholesale destruction of historical evidence. And you have to focus almost forensically on the few facts that you can be confident of. As if we're detectives on this verge of cracking this sensational story of whodunit or what it's really all about. Perhaps more accurately, if you're uncovering an ancient and unacknowledged miscarriage of justice, is what this looks like. For time and time again, when you critically examine what genuine evidence remains, we find that the history of Christianity bequeathed to us by the Roman Catholic Church was a gross distortion of truth. Actually, the evidence completely endorsed the Jesus mystery thesis. The real evidence, when you dig deeper, has the Jesus mysteries all built into them. And this was becoming increasingly obvious with the research that's been done in this area. This looking into the historical Jesus and into Gnosticism over the years. That it had been we had been deliberately deceived by the church. The Gnostics were indeed the original Christians, and that their anarchic mysticism had been hijacked by an authoritarian institution, which had created it from a dogmatic religion. A dogmatic religion. And then they brutally enforced the greatest cover-up in history. Look at the Inquisition. Why is it that if you didn't believe in the love of Jesus Christ and the love of God and the love of Christianity, that you could be burned at the stake or tortured? Why was it that the early Gnostics were tortured out of existence? And it brutally reinforces this great cover-up in history. Now, one of the major players in this great cover-up is a guy called Eusebius. You may have heard of him, maybe not. At the beginning of the 4th century, beneath Emperor Constantine, who convoked some of the first councils, church councils, declared himself Pope as the Emperor of Rome. He was the Emperor of Rome, and he declared himself Pope. It was Eusebius who worked for him, who compiled from legends, fabrications, and his own imagination that the only early history of Christianity that was valid was the one that still exists today, the one that we accept in our churches. But it was really put together by Eusebius. All the subsequent histories have been forced to base themselves on Eusebius's dubious claim. Say that fast. Eusebius's dubious claims. Because there has been little, if any, other information to draw on. All of those with a different perspective on Christianity were branded as heretics. They were eradicated. They were tortured. They were killed. And in this way, falsehoods compiled in the 4th century have come down to us as established facts. When I wrote my book on the Nephilim, I talked about this because it was Constantine, the emperor, who in 325 convoked one of the first councils, biblical councils, ecclesiastical councils, I'm sorry. And his mandate was, I don't care what conclusions you come to, they just need to be unanimous. Because Constantine, the emperor of Rome, was out to do two things. Establish that there was one emperor and one religion. One God and one religion. One God equaling one emperor, one religion equaling one empire. And so when it came down to where he started the process during these councils to decide what books belonged in the Bible and which did not, how did we get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the others? And others were and the other 55 Gospels were thrown out. How did they come to those conclusions? They had to vote on them, and Constantine, I don't care which ones you have in there, you just better damn well be unanimous in your decisions. And where they couldn't be unanimous, they took those books and put them in the apocryphal books. Some of them. Others they just throughout, and we didn't discover them again until hundreds of years later. So in this way, the falsehoods that were compiled in the 4th century have come down to us as the established facts through the Roman Church. Eusebius was employed by Constantine, who made Christianity the state religion of the empire. He gave literalist Christianity the power it needed to begin the final eradication of paganism and Gnosticism. Constantine wanted one God and one religion to consolidate his claim of one empire and one emperor. He oversaw the creation of the Nicene Creed, the article of faith repeated in churches to this day. And Christians who refused to assent to this creed were banished from the empire or otherwise silenced. So this Christian empire then returned home from Nicaea. The emperor, not empire. This Christian emperor, Constantine, returned home from Nicaea and had his wife suffocated to death and his son murdered, deliberately remained unbaptized until his deathbed so he could continue his atrocities and still receive forgiveness of sins and a guaranteed place in heaven by being baptized at the last moment of breath. This is the kind of guy he was. And although he had his spin doctor, Eusebius, compose a suitably obsequious biography for him, he was actually a monster. He was as monstrous as many of the other Roman emperors that you've read about or heard about. And it was really not surprising at all that a history of the origins of Christianity, created by an employee of the service of a Roman tyrant, should turn out to be a pack of lies. Is that surprising to you? You know, folks, I'm looking at my clock, and we're just about done here. We only got about a minute and a half left here, and I got to sign off. But I want you to think about these things. We're going to pick up with this again. Think about this stuff, not as heresy. It's going to feel that way inside if you have a belief system you go by. But step back for a minute and ask, is this what true Christianity is about? Was there a founding Jesus Christ? Were there a bunch of Jesus Christ's archetypes that created a picture for us of what we were supposed to become, making ourselves Christs? We're going to expound on that more over the coming days. And this stuff is really, it can be really heart-wrenching if you're indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking. So maybe, and not to steal a line from my friend Jeff Dougherty, but he says unindoctrinate yourself. I say detach yourself from what you think you know and look a little deeper. And next time when we come back, after this next 23-hour break, we're going to cover this some more. So you sit tight. We'll see you tomorrow night.